We can speak now to Sir John Curtice, who is a professor of politics at the University of Strathclyde, who's been providing coverage of British elections since 1979. Thank you so much for joining us, Sir John. Just tell us, first of all, this announcement by Nigel Farage, how potentially damaging do you think this is going to be to Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party?
Well, it's potentially substantially damaging. The Reform Party's vote, which is running at about 11% in the opinion polls, and crucially has so far not fallen away during this election campaign. That vote is coming primarily from people who voted Conservative in 2019, while the results of the local elections in England at the beginning of May, where Reform stood in some of the contests but not in others, the difference in the result between those two contests suggests very strongly that where Reform were on the ballot paper, it was indeed the Conservatives that suffered. So both pieces of evidence point in the same direction. Now, whether or not Mr. Farage is going to succeed in substantially increasing Reform support above that 11% figure, we'll have to wait and see. There's been some polling done which asked people what they would do if Farage were leader. It suggested he might add 2 or 3 points to that 11%. But if all that Mr. Farage simply does is to keep that 11% more or less intact, that is bad news for the Conservatives. They're more than 20 points behind in the opinion polls. Squeezing back, winning back the many voters they've lost to Reform was, as it were, the move that would get them to base camp in this very substantial challenge that they face. And if Reforms to keep on winning 11% of the campaign, that vote is primarily going to take place in Conservative-held constituencies, and B, because Reform's predecessor, the Brexit Party, did not fight Conservative-held constituencies in 2019, it's going to do particular damage in those seats. So all ways round, certainly unless Mr. Farage fluffs his challenge, it's going to make life more difficult for the Conservatives.
I wonder how voters are going to feel about that, essentially handing, therefore, a considerable gift to the Labour Party, which is what Nigel Farage has done. I mean, that's going to be the way, I'd imagine, the mainstream right wing will spin this, isn't it?
Oh, well, yeah, there is no doubt. That is the argument that the Conservative Party is using. It's been using it throughout this campaign, so far without a great deal of effect. The problem the Conservatives potentially face is that the disenchantment that those who have switched to Reform feel, like, frankly, the many 2019 Conservative voters who've switched to Labour, the disenchantment they feel is such that they would rather vote for a party that they feel truly believes in Brexit. Many of them feel that the Conservative Party has not taken advantage of Brexit, a party that really would manage to reduce immigration, whereas, of course, in the wake of Brexit, immigration has actually risen in the UK. As a result, and they're unhappy about the Conservatives on the economy, on the health service, which are the two big issues that are pushing the Conservative vote down. In the end, they may just decide that expressing their protest is more important than trying to save the Conservatives, perhaps particularly so, given that at the moment, at least, there doesn't seem much chance of Sir Keir Starmer being stopped anyway.
You mentioned the economy, usually the most important thing in people's minds when they cast their ballots. But actually, there have been some quite encouraging figures coming out of the UK. And Rishi Sunak could, perhaps tonight, will claim some credit for bringing inflation back right under control, all the way down from 11% down to about 2% where it is now. The housing market having some surprising uptick in certain parts of the country. The jobless situation not too bad. I mean, it isn't that bad, is it, the economic picture in the UK right now?
Well, as compared with the fairly dismal 4.5 years that we've had throughout this Parliament, it's been the Parliament in which the public have been more pessimistic about the economy than any other. It's not entirely the government's fault. The COVID pandemic and the Russian-Ukraine war bear a lot of responsibility, but it's a relatively recent turnaround in the public mood. But the question that hangs over the Conservatives is if indeed the public are beginning to feel a bit more optimistic, and there are some signs of that, will they be willing to give the Conservative Party the credit, given that they are widely regarded as having a heavy hand of responsibility for what happened in the wake of Liz Truss's so-called fiscal event, which caused a market crisis. And we have to remember that no post-war British government that's presided over a market crisis has subsequently survived at the ballot box. Even John Major, who after Black Wednesday in September 1992, when the pound was forced out of the European exchange rate mechanism by the markets, we had 4.5 years of the best economic growth that Britain had experienced since 1945 at that time. The electorate still weren't willing to give the credit for the government because they remembered the market crisis. And the Labour Party are certainly constantly reminding the public of Liz Truss and the market crisis around by her fiscal event throughout this election campaign.
Okay, so unlikely you're saying that the electorate will forgive the Conservative Party as they didn't for John Major either. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. I'm afraid we're out of time. That's Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. Thank you.